Okay, so to begin this next activity, we are going to be exploring repetition, so repeating objects and using watercolor to do some color mixing, okay? So let me briefly explain how this process is going to work. So the first thing that you need to do is you need to pick an object, okay? So I have two different examples here. So I have an example of using light bulbs. You will notice that even though the light bulbs, I'm using a light bulb, not all of the light bulbs are the same. I did different types of shapes, okay? Here's the other example, which is maybe a little bit more difficult to see just because it's using pencil. But I did different shapes of limes. So lime slices that are cut in different ways right now, okay? So although I'm using the same object, I switched it up a little bit, okay? And it is okay to maybe, maybe you wanted to do like a fruit theme. So you're like, okay, I'm gonna do an orange slice and some grapes. That's fine, okay? But the key for this is that you need to have repeating shapes and they need to be overlapping. There shouldn't be any areas that are just not overlapping at all, okay? And let's count how many light bulbs I have here. I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, okay? You should have at least somewhere between 10 to 15 drawings of your object. Notice that they are different sizes. Some of them are big, some of them are small, okay? So you'll build the page that way. Once you have done that, once you've picked your object, you'll come get a piece of paper and you will start drawing it out with a pencil. Now, from here, you may choose to outline it with Sharpie or just leave it as a pencil, okay? That's up to you. Or maybe you don't know if you want it to be in Sharpie or not yet, so we can wait for that until we get started with the watercolor, and maybe you re-outline it after that, okay? So at this point, what you need to do is go get a piece of paper, pick out your object, maybe draw on your sketchbook first, and start coming up with your design and your object for your final drawing here. So pause the video. Okay, so once you have this done, so I'm not gonna finish outlining all of these because I want you to kind of see the difference. You are going to get set up with some watercolors, okay? All of the watercolor stuff that you need is over by the sink. So there are two things that there's more than two things that you're going to need, but you are going to need 2 cups of water. Notice that they are only about halfway full. One is for a clean cup, one is for a dirty cup. You can share these with your table partner as well. You will also need a set of watercolor. I will just have you store these in your bin when we're not using them. You're going to want a brush. I would recommend getting like a small test piece of paper if you need it. And then you're going to want to have this circle palette that we mix all of our colors in before we use. And I'll just explain that very, very quickly. But first, I want you to notice here, do you see how like these watercolors look pretty good, except for this yellow? So if you ever see something like that, just get the color wet. Then take a paper towel and you can kind of wipe it away. You might have to let it soak a little bit more, but especially on the yellow, you're gonna see that happen. Okay, so that's one way you can kind of clean that up. You can see that that's getting better, but I'll probably have to do it a couple more times. Okay, so let's talk about getting set up with what we need. So to begin, any color that we're going to use, we are going to put a drop of water in to get wet. Now notice I am not touching my brush to the paint. I am just dropping over top, okay? Now, if you know you're not gonna use some of these colors, don't get them wet, okay? Now, let's explain the water cups. So I'm gonna use my test paper here. Let's explain the water cups and your little mixing palette, okay? So, anytime you are painting, with watercolor, we should never just dip in here directly and paint right on top of here, okay? That is not the way that watercolor is supposed to be used. This is way too dark. I can't even see the paper through it, okay? And what you need to do instead is always, so this is where I'm gonna practice my dirty and clean water brushes or water cups. So you pick. So you're gonna pick one to be dirty, one to be clean. So I'm gonna make this the dirty one. And anytime I dip back into this color, I'm always gonna go into the clean one here. So this cup should get kind of dirty. This one will stay pretty clear. But as we do this, what I'm going to do is I'm always gonna take my clear and I'm gonna put a couple of just dots of water into my paint palette here. Then I can go into my paint and add this here. Okay, so now I've just added a little bit of water. Let's look at the difference in color there. Okay, so notice that this version is not so thick and it is a little bit more see-through. Okay, so that is what you need to do with that. You'll also notice, and then if you want it to be lighter, rinse and add more water. But what you'll also notice with this is that I am doing nice long brush strokes, okay? I like to call it sweeping the floor. You're not scrubbing with our paintbrush, okay? But your watercolors should be nice and thin like this, somewhere in between these two, okay? Which is really, really important for our next step here. All right, so that's how the watercolor setup should work. I'm gonna move some of this stuff out of the way. But we're gonna do talk about our next steps with this. So we are going to be practicing some color mixing. And to do that, you're gonna have to pick a color scheme. So I'm just going to use the primary colors right now, which are red, yellow, and blue. So what I'm gonna get set up here is I'm gonna get set up a couple sections of water. I'm just putting clean water there. I'm going to use blue, dirty brush, clean brush. I'm going to use yellow. Okay. And then I'm going to use my red. All right. So if you want to make a couple different variations of this, you totally can. So for instance, maybe you're like, oh, I kind of want like a blue-green color. Well, we'll probably end up making that anyway, but you can go ahead and mix those colors in there as well, depending on what you want, okay? So it's always a good idea before you get started, take that test paper, kind of do a color swatch to make sure that those are the colors that you want. And we want these to be light right now, okay? So what you are going to do is you are going to start by painting in the shape, okay? So notice this one overlaps, but I'm filling in the entire thing. When it dries, we will come back to it, okay? Now notice, that yellow isn't super, super dark, which is fine. Okay, so I'm just filling this in, practicing my brush control, going in like that. For now, I'm just focusing on the bulbs. I'm not gonna worry about these little filament details here. I'm gonna add different details to those later, okay? So I'm gonna skip around a bit, because I can't move on to the next part until an area is dry. So I'm gonna use this one yellow, and I'm gonna do a couple other spots yellow. Okay, so I have a bunch of empty spaces here, and now my next step will be to fill in some of these other shapes. But when I do this, it's important that I do not pick colors that are touching each other right now. I need to make sure that this is really dry. So for instance, I can't paint right here in this one, but I can paint in this one, okay? So I'm gonna do a couple of those. I won't be able to do a lot of them until some of them dry a little bit more. But I'm going to do a blue. Okay, so at this point, I need to give this a little bit of time to dry. So that would probably be a good stopping point, depending on where you're at. But I'm gonna let these dry and then we'll show you what the next step is. Okay, so once this is dry, so meaning that when you lift it up, water doesn't run down. And remember, we should never do that with a painting anyway. But you touch these and it's wet to the touch, or dry to the touch, excuse me. We can start with the next combination. So now what we're going to be doing is we're going to actually start overlapping those colors. So even though it looks like I maybe would only paint in this area, you're going to overlap the entire thing. And so when you do that, you start to see a little color mixing happening. Okay, so where the blue overlaps the red, it's kind of giving off a purple color, and then where the yellow overlaps the red, it's a little bit of an orange color. So you can do that with whatever your color scheme is until you've filled up the entire, all of your objects. Okay, so from here, when these start to dry, you might actually be able to layer over top of it. So for instance, maybe I want this yellow to be a little bit brighter, but it's important that you do this when it dries. Otherwise, you're just gonna have a blob of mixed colors. But when I go over this where the yellow is with the red, it creates a little bit of a nicer orange color. So you'll layer over these all again, okay? Now, as you start to do that, maybe you want your objects to be a little bit more interesting. Let me show you what I mean by that, okay? So let's take this blue, for instance. Maybe I want this blue to start a little darker on one side, so I add more of that dark blue. And then I kind of fade it out a little bit. Okay, but you can already see by adding that next layer of colors there, it brightens everything up so much, okay? So you will continue to do that. We'll talk about the backgrounds and stuff in the next video. So just continue layering this. I did want to show you another example. So this is that same lime example that I was doing, a little bit of a different color scheme though. That could be an option for you as well. But you'll notice some of these colors when they mix together maybe aren't as pretty as the other ones. So for instance, watch what happens here. It's a little too thick. When I overlap the green with the orange, you kind of get like a kind of a brown green color, which is okay because that's what happens when those colors overlap and mix, okay? So I'm gonna throw in kind of a, let's do a purple. Okay, so don't be afraid to add different layers of colors to it. I'll show you how to finish these off, like I said, in the next video.